Well, hello everybody. Thank you, Jeff. And it's wonderful to be back in spirit, if not physically, at the wonderful Port Washington Library. Now, I'm sure a lot of you recognize me and have heard my talks for years at the Port Washington Library. It's my Friday afternoon time slot, sometimes at 12 and then sometimes at 3. So it's great to be back here. Well, what we are doing now is the continuation of our series on the great cities of the world. I mean, we've done Paris and London and all kinds of Shanghai and every place. Well, today we're doing a city within a city, and that is the famous neighborhood of the Lower East Side. Now, again, my name is Ron Brown, and I teach history and political science at Touro College, which has its main campus in Manhattan, but I teach at a branch campus out here in Forest Hills. So I go into the Lower East Side all the time, and for many years, I was a licensed New York City tour guide and did walking tours of the Lower East Side. And even until today, I take my students when I do immigration history or ethnic history. I take my students and we do a walking tour of the Lower East Side. Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to me today who have Lower East Side stories or a history of the Lower East Side where your family was associated with this wonderful city within a city. Well, we're going to take a very broad view of the history of the Lower East Side. Like every neighborhood, we tend to associate Harlem with African Americans, but we forget that there was a Jewish Harlem. There was the upper middle class white Harlem. We tend to think of Washington Heights, which was a German Reformed Jewish neighborhood, now is a Dominican neighborhood. Jackson Heights, right near where I live, had a very long and diverse history, and today it is a Hispanic neighborhood. And we won't even talk about Flushing. I'm sure the people listening to me today who know Flushing, and once again, have witnessed the constant change of a neighborhood. New people coming in, a flourishing golden age of a particular ethnic group, those people move out, and new people move in. So this is our outline today. It's 5 after 12. I'll talk until about 1 o'clock, and then we'll throw it open to questions. You can send in on the chat line, and Jeff will moderate them. And then at the end, he'll open the mic, and you can give some other comments or stories. Well, I'm going to be talking about the 5 golden ages of the Lower East Side. From right after the American Revolution, the Lower East Side became the homeland for lower class poor immigrants from Scotland and England. For almost half a century, Lower East Side was Little Scotland, Little England. Then in the 1840s, the arrival of the Irish and the Germans, and they built their churches, they built their synagogues, they built their clubs, and Lower East Side was synonymous with Irish and German immigrants. And then at the late 1800s, the Eastern European Jews came over, 500,000, once again staking their claim to the Lower East Side. Well then, since 1965, the Lower East Side has once again become homeland to a whole new group of new immigrants. And finally, I'm sure that somewhere along the line when I'm giving this very same PowerPoint program or walking around with my students, we're going to see the first aliens arriving from Mars and Jupiter and taking over the Lower East Side and adding still another chapter to this magnificent neighborhood. So let's get going. Now, this is a map. You can see Lower Manhattan. You see City Hall right in the middle with Chambers Street behind it. Well, if you turn right at City Hall, you'll walk through Chinatown. Above that, you see Little Italy. And then we see the Lower East Side along the East River, streets like Delancey, Broome, Essex, East Broadway, forming that triangle, which is the Lower East Side. Well, this was one of the historic ethnic neighborhoods. Once again, if you go to Little Italy, you're going to have to search high and low for an Italian. If you go to Lower East Side, they're going to be the remnants of all of the previous immigrant groups, but a constantly changing population. Now, the Lower East Side emerged, as you can see the map on the right, Houston Street down that area is what we call today the Lower East Side. Now, back in the 1770s, the Lower East Side was not called the Lower East Side because there was an Upper East Side. There was no Upper East Side in 1776. What we call the Upper East Side of Manhattan was covered with trees and swamps, and there were even Indians and roaming around there. The Lower East Side, as you can see from the map on the left, where the Lower East Side is, was a low-lying swampy area. And it was called Lower East Side because it was low in elevation. So on the map on the left, we see this settled part in 1776, which didn't go much beyond the current city hall, but there were a couple of neighborhoods beyond that taking shape, and one of them was called the Lower East Side. Now on this map, we see the city of New York about the time of the Revolution. But if we look at the top of that picture, we see swampy meadow. We see below that the swamp. We see a collect pond. It was low-lying and it was swampy, which means, well, today it's raining here in Queens and we're going to have rain all weekend. Well, back in the colonial times in early 1800s, when it rained in Lower Manhattan, all of the water drained into this swampy, low-lying area, which means every time it rained, your basement of the houses on the right, we see, would be flooded. And of course, when it floods, you're going to get mosquitoes. And when you get mosquitoes, you're going to get malaria. You're going to get cholera. You're going to get flu epidemics. And so in historic Lower East Side, whenever you mentioned that you lived in the Lower East Side, that meant that you were a new immigrant. You were forced to live in a rundown building that flooded every time there was a rainstorm or, God forbid, a hurricane. So the Lower East Side became synonymous with new immigrants, impoverished immigrants, immigrants who had no other place to go. One step off of the boat, they went to the Lower East Side. They would rent floor space to sleep on. They knew that it was infested with disease. Whenever there was an epidemic of cholera or influenza or anything in colonial New York, the Lower East Side was the most viciously afflicted neighborhood. Well, this area was swampy, it was dangerous. Well, in 1813, the city government decided that the area was so infested with disease, so dangerous, that it was necessary to drain the collect pond and the swampy meadow, which you see on the left. And so they drained the swamp and they built a canal which led from this swampy area across Manhattan into the Hudson River. And that is today's Canal Street. So at one time, there was a canal there to drain this swampy area. Well, gradually, the area continued to attract new immigrants because you could drain it, but yet it was not a very pleasant place to live. You may have heard of the area called 5 Points, which is today on the border between Chinatown and Little Italy and the Lower East Side. Those were 5 streets came together. It was the most notorious area for drugs, for alcohol, for gambling, for murders. It was not at all unusual to go to the 5 Points area and in the early morning to see dead bodies or people who had frozen to death in the winter, just laying on the street waiting to be picked up. In fact, there's a wonderful movie called The 5 Points, or The Gangs of New York. You may have heard of that. And these pictures here show the kinds of buildings. You can see on the upper right, the wooden shacks that were built, which were the cheapest type of accommodation. Constant fires would ravage the area. Below that, we see some of the brick houses being built, but yet people had cows and sheep and goats. The most popular animal in the Lower East Side and Little Italy and Chinatown was, of course, the pig. The pig was a protected animal in New York City because the pig was the walking, 4-legged garbage disposal. So if you were a housewife and you had potato peels or some type of spoiled food, you would just throw it out the window and the pigs would come running. And so to touch a pig in the Lower East Side was a crime. And if you look at the picture on the left, the notorious 5 Points area, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see a pig. Because everybody knew that if you got rid of the pigs of New York, the city would be overrun with rats. And so pigs were a protected animal and it ate the garbage. So this is the area, the 5 Points, which eventually emerged as the Lower East Side, Chinatown, and Little Italy. Well, the first group to settle in this very unpleasant area, low-lying and swampy and dangerous, were, of course, English and Scottish poor people. Well, here on this picture, we see one of the buildings dating from 1826, which is still standing. This was the Willett Street Methodist Church. These were poor, lower class English immigrants who flooded into New York following independence, and they did what they could to survive, and they built this Methodist church. Now, if you look closely at this church, you'll see that it's not built like St. Patrick's Cathedral of big blocks of cut stone. If you look closely, you'll see it's made out of rocks, which you could pick up from any construction site. And the people themselves built it. It was designed by the early pastor. The parishioners would come on a Saturday and Sunday, bringing bags of cement. Kids would round up rocks, and they would build this church. There's nothing elegant about it. It's functional, it was cheap, but it was their church. Well, as the Lower East Side emerged from the Scottish and the English period, and other people moved in, well, as you can see, it was sold eventually to Eastern European Jews, and today it is a functioning synagogue, the Bialystoker Synagogue in the Lower East Side. So many of the buildings that we'll see in the Lower East Side have gone through various denominations. There's one synagogue that was built as a German Protestant church, became an Orthodox synagogue, and is today a Buddhist temple. Not at all unusual for the Lower East Side, because when a new immigrant group would move in, they stayed until they could get out of there and move to a healthier neighborhood. So a constant turnover of population. This is another church which is still standing, 1829 on Henry Street. You can see the picture on the right, back in the good old days when it had a nice wooden tower. Well, that was blown off. and never replaced. But once again, you look at the picture on the left, you see it's made of stone, stones that you'd pick up from any construction site. The workers would come down, the parishioners, they would build it, the women would bring food, and they would turn it into a construction weekend, and the kids would be playing and doing what they could, and the men would build the church. Nothing elegant, nothing beautiful, but it was functional. Now, St. Augustine's Episcopal Church is still an Episcopal church. And at the picture in the bottom right, we see the slave gallery. Because don't forget, New York was a major slave-holding city. Anybody of any importance in New York City in the colonial period and up into the 1820s owned slaves. And this church still preserves the gallery upper area, and it's marked BM, meaning black members. So even when slavery was abolished in 1829, the black members of the church were still relegated to the upper gallery. And so this church, again, stands on Henry Street, not far from the Henry Street Settlement House, which a lot of you may recognize, but testifies to this wonderful age when the Lower East Side was English and Scottish. The Scots came over, and here we see on the right the famous Rutger's Church. This was the first Presbyterian church, dating from 1841, right off of East Broadway. It too lost its tower in a storm. It too was built of field stone, and it was built by Presbyterians. Presbyterian Church is the national church of Scotland. Now, it was built and named in honor of Henry Rutgers. Now, you may have heard of Rutgers University over there in New Jersey. Well, it's the very same Rutgers family who migrated to New York penniless, settled in the Lower East Side, constructed and participated in the construction of this little church made of field stone. And gradually, when they got a little bit of financial success, moved out of the city, moved to Jersey, and in his later years, Henry Rutgers donated money and land to build the Rutgers University. So this church is still standing today. Once again, when the Scots Presbyterians moved out, the Irish Catholics took it over, and it is today St. Teresa's Roman Catholic Church. So it has served two different communities. Well, as the Scots and the English got a little bit of success and moved out of the Lower East Side, by the 1840s, two new groups were migrating. These were the Irish fleeing the potato famine and the Germans fleeing civil war and conflict as Germany was getting united. At the top picture, we see the famous Thomas Nast cartoon showing the arriving Catholics as crocodiles being sent by the Vatican in the distance to immigrate and to take over America. And so you see the good Protestants on the shore cowering, confronting the hordes of Irish Catholics overrunning the country. Well, of course, when the Irish were fleeing the potato famine, they didn't come with bags of money. They were dumped in the Lower East Side. They did what they could to survive. They spoke Gaelic. The majority couldn't even read and write. Well, they were fleeing persecution by the English who occupied Ireland, and they were fleeing the potato famine. The Germans, you can see the map in the middle at the bottom. I mean, Germany in the 1860s and 70s was divided into a host of little countries, often at war with each other. The revolution of 1848 caused upheaval, and many of them migrated. part of my father's family. If you look at the map of Prussia there, see in the upper right-hand corner, Danzig, which is today the Polish city of Gdansk. Part of my family came from there. They were the Ojdowski family. And my great-grandmother from Danzig, asked her once, I said, well, why did you migrate to America? And she said, we didn't want our boys to go into the Prussian army. And so this was typical of the German migrants. Now, my family didn't come and settle in the Lower East Side. They ended up in Pittsburgh, which was a growing city, industrial city. But this is the second big wave of immigration, the Irish and the Germans. Well, the Irish were persecuted. Look at the picture on the right top, another Thomas Nast. Good old Thomas Nast, a good German Protestant, hated the Catholics. And here we see the cowering Catholic priest and the Irish immigrant portrayed as a pipe-smoking guerrilla. No love for the Irish. The Irish were persecuted. No Irish need apply for jobs. But yet, they made the Lower East Side their home. They built St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church, which is on Grand Street, which is still standing, and which is still a Catholic church. Now, of course, the Irish are long gone, but there are many Mexicans and Hispanics who have settled in the Lower East Side now, and they have simply taken over the church. So if you go to the church, half of the masses on Sunday will be in Spanish. German Lutherans came. They built the giant brick German Lutheran church in 1857. I went into that German Lutheran church when it had already become a German Orthodox synagogue in 1864. And it was a magnificent building where you saw remnants of the time when it was a German Lutheran church, the pulpit. Then it became an Orthodox synagogue. And on the right, you see the building being torn down. In fact, I was one of the last people to go into the Shaarei Hashomayim synagogue and take pictures of the interior until I was kicked out because I wasn't supposed to be in there. And a couple days later, there was a so-called electrical fire and the building was burned. But still, it shows, once again, the German Lutherans settling in the Lower East Side and then being replaced by Eastern Europe or by German Orthodox Jews. Here again, we see St. Teresa's Roman Catholic Church, the Rutgers Protestant Church. Well, it was made into a Catholic church in 1863, and it too remains a Catholic church until today, with a predominantly Spanish-speaking congregation. So once again, each building has gone through a succession of different congregations. The Norfolk Street German Baptist Church on the left, 1850, high point of the German Protestant immigration. It too became a synagogue, and this was the Beit Midrash Hagodol. Then this building, when it became an Eastern European Orthodox synagogue, that is the very building where Yeshiva University began. The Eastern European Jews bought it from the German Protestants, turned it into a synagogue. And this building, you can see, it still has the Gothic windows and it looks like sort of church-like, but the writing above the door is in Hebrew. It is, again, on the verge of collapsing because it goes back to the 1850s. And so it would cost a fortune to redevelop it. And as you can see, the price of real estate is skyrocketing. You can see in the building on the right, a big apartment building going up. I'm sure they would love to see this synagogue burned to the ground, buy the land, and build another skyscraper. Other German Jewish synagogues of the Lower East Side. This is Rodef Shalom, 1853, as a German Reform synagogue. On the right, we see the first home of Temple Emmanuel, 1848. Once again, German Reform Jews started out in an apartment, gradually bought this building on Christie Street, eventually moved up to Fifth Avenue. So the Lower East Side was Irish, it was German Catholic, it was German Protestant, and German Reform Jewish. This is another synagogue which is still standing. This is the Anshe Chesed, which began its origin as a German Reform synagogue. Once again, it looks very churchy with its Gothic decorations. Today, it still exists as a synagogue, one of the very few German Reform synagogues which still exists in the Lower East Side. It is today called the Orensanz Center, and it is used for Reform Jewish holidays, but also for weddings, because you can see from the interior, it is an absolutely beautiful interior, even though it dates back to almost 150 years, but it still survives. Now, it was during the German and the Irish immigration period that the first tenements were being built. Now, of course, the old tenements going back to the mid-1800s didn't have running water. The toilets were outhouse in the back, and the people were really crammed in one upon the other. The Lower East Side, even in the middle 1800s, when it was Irish and German, still had a very unhealthy reputation because new immigrants would arrive. They would find floor space to sleep on. Sometimes in the middle of the winter, with all the windows closed, you'd have 5 or 6 new immigrants sleeping on the floor, wrapped up in blankets. Well, one person coughs, and it's not the COVID-19 that was circulating back then, but it was tuberculosis. It was other diseases such as cholera. The Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which you can see on the right, preserves this immigration history. And when you go to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, each building, each of the many tenements that it owns and has restored, it has devoted to a different period. So you'll go to one apartment and it'll be Scottish immigrants from the early 1800s. Another apartment will be German Reform Jews from the mid-1800s, or German Lutherans, or an Irish Catholic immigrant from the 1850s. And so they preserve the individual histories of all these different immigrant groups. By the 1870s, another group of immigrants was arriving, and these were the Eastern European immigrants. Now, when we say Eastern European, we mean mainly the Russian Empire. Poland had been absorbed by Russia and Austria. We mean Ukrainian, which was part of Russia. We mean Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and to an extent, Austria. So these were the Orthodox Jews of Eastern Europe, not the German Reform Jews of Germany. They migrated en masse beginning in the 1870s. So by the time they got to the Lower East Side, the tenement buildings were already there. The Irish and the Germans had learned English, and they were moving to the Bronx, to Queens, to Staten Island, to Brooklyn, getting out of this unhealthy, cramped environment and moving on. So the apartments were empty. The stores were closing down. The tenement apartments were emptying out. So the Eastern European Jews moved into the Lower East Side. By 1914, there were 500,000 Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews who were crammed into the Lower East Side. In 1914, they make the comparison of the population intensity, the concentration of people in 1914. They compare it to Hong Kong, which is the most heavily populated city in the world, concentration of people, or the Gaza Strip, where you have millions of Palestinians dumped when Israel was established. And so if you want an experience of the intensity of population of the Lower East Side, go to the Gaza Strip or to Hong Kong, and you'll see literally millions of people living one on top of the other. And from the street scenes, you may have seen the movie Hester Street, which really captures this atmosphere. The push carts on the street. The grocery stores were literally on the streets. A farmer from someplace, maybe New Jersey or Brooklyn or Queens, would bring in the produce, the potatoes, the milk. You had to buy your food every day. Back in the 1870s and 80s, nobody had a refrigerator. You didn't buy frozen chicken when it was on sale and keep it for a couple of weeks like I do. You didn't buy a gallon of milk and put it in the refrigerator. You went out every morning and you bought your bread for the day. You brought your meat, if you could afford it, for the day. You brought the milk for the kids and hoping that it wasn't diluted with water. And so this is another chapter in the Lower East Side, Eastern European Orthodox Jews. In 1885, they bought the old German church, and this was where Rabbi Moses Matlin, in 1855, migrated to New York, established a yeshiva, which grew and eventually became Yeshiva University. Now, the Lower East Side had about 500 synagogues, ranging in size from a closet to a giant synagogue like Beit Midrash Hagodol. But unfortunately, very few rabbis migrated from Eastern Europe to the Lower East Side. So you had synagogues everywhere, but very few of them had a rabbi, which meant the Orthodox culture of the Lower East Side died very quickly. There was nobody to teach the next generation how to celebrate the holidays, to read the Torah, to learn Hebrew. And so it was Rabbi Moses Matlin, who was one of the very few ordained rabbis who came over from Lithuania, took over this old church, turned it into a yeshiva, which became the university, but very intent on preserving Orthodox Jewish culture. But he was one of the very, very few who came over. Most of the rabbis, in fact, said, don't go to America. America will destroy your soul. You'll lose your religion. If you stay in Russia, the Cossacks might kill your body, but at least you'll die a good Orthodox Jew. So the 500,000 Orthodox Jews who migrated to the Lower East Side ended up assimilating, becoming Reformed Jews, moving to wonderful places on Long Island, or even marrying Irish and German girls and disappearing. So it is really a fascinating history of a disappearing immigrant group who melted into the melting pot. Here we see on the right the interior of the old English Methodist church, which was then turned into the Bialystoker Synagogue. Now, a lot of you might know what a bialy is, okay? It is that pastry in the middle at the bottom. In fact, it's named after the town of Bialystoker, which is in either Poland or Russia or Ukraine on the border there. And each synagogue, the Bialystoker synagogue was called a Landsmannschaft synagogue in Yiddish and German, which means the Jews from a particular town would establish their own synagogue. They knew each other. They spoke the same dialect of Yiddish. They had similar memories, or in the case of the Bialystoker synagogue, they had their own unique pastries. Now, the synagogue remains. You can see on the right, the old Methodist church was highly decorated, paintings all over the place. You see the bima and the pulpit and everything. Although most of the Jews have assimilated and disappeared. But the Bialystoker also maintained the Bialystoker Home for the Aged, where you can see it on the left, which still functions, where you still have some of the older Jews, Yiddish speaking or remaining Orthodox to the extent that they can, but that still exists. Other smaller synagogues still exist in the Lower East Side from this golden age of the Jewish Lower East Side. We see the congregation BNAI, the sons of Jacob, on Stanton Street, which on the left, the building is still there. The facade still looks like a synagogue with two doors, one on the right and one on the left, one for men and one for women. Star of David is still in the window, but it is now an apartment building. So at least they have preserved the facade. The one on the right is the Keila Kadosha Yanina Romaniut. These are Jews from Greece who migrated to Lower East Side. And this is still a functioning Greek Orthodox Jewish synagogue. They have their own language, which is a mixture of Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, as Yiddish is a mixture of German, Polish, and Hebrew and Aramaic. But this synagogue still functions, even though the vast majority of the people have long moved on. They have a wonderful museum which you can visit, and it is one of the synagogues that still survives on Broome Street. Two other buildings which remain from this golden age of the Jewish Lower East Side was the Daily Forward building, which was until today Vorwärts in Yiddish, or Daily Forward, which is the largest Yiddish-speaking newspaper. And you can see way up at the top under the clock, you can see it's marked Vorwärts in Yiddish. And I always take my students who from Toro who speak Hebrew, but they don't speak Yiddish, and I point out the sign and they are saying, my God, what kind of Hebrew is that? But it is in Yiddish. Now, like this, many buildings in the Lower East Side, the Daily Forward building was now part of Chinatown. The Chinese have taken it over, its apartments, its buildings. It is owned by a Chinese Christian church. On the right is the Jarmulowsky's Bank, 1873 to 1911. And this was the largest Orthodox Jewish bank in the Lower East Side. Now, banks were important. You can imagine back in the 1870s or 80s, you migrated, young guy of 22 years old, gets off of the boat at Ellis Island, ends up settling in the Lower East Side, gets a job doing whatever he can. His first concern is to send money back to Russia to bring over the rest of his family. And so banking was important. I mean, I know it's unimaginable, but in the 1880s, there was no American Express or Visa card. There was no way of sending money back to Tsarist Russia. And you can be sure that when some young guy went into the Jarmulowsky's bank and said, I want to send this money back to Russia, well, the bank took a chunk. The Russians took a chunk. The Russian bank took a chunk. And by the time it got to his younger brother, who he hoped to bring over, maybe half of the money had survived, which is still a very big problem for new immigrants today, sending money back to Mexico or Central America or China or Africa. So the bank was a very important economic institution. Now, of course, everybody spoke Yiddish. Everybody knew everybody else. It was closed on Saturday and Friday at noon, but it was the only bank in New York that had permission to stay open on Sunday. So it was part of the ethnic infrastructure of the Jewish Lower East Side. Here we see the forward building, which is the entrance at street level. And on the below that, you see Vorwärts written in the Hebrew letters, but the Yiddish language. Now, the Jewish Lower East Side is undergoing major transformations. As you can see from this interesting blue building, which is going up, every time I go to the Lower East Side and I see a building that still captures either the Scottish or the English or the Irish or the German or the Jewish chapter in history, I always point it out and take a picture. And because the next time I go, there's a very good chance it will be gone. At the bottom, you see the Mendel Goldberg's Fabrics, which is a store. The sign is still there, but the store, I guess, has long since disappeared. And I'm sure that the next time I go down, even the sign will be gone. So every little tidbit that preserves the history should be cherished. In the Lower East Side, there was the famous Yiddish Theater. In fact, it was in the Lower East Side that the first Yiddish English newspapers, the first Yiddish English dictionaries were made. And here you see everything from the People's Theater, the rabbi's family with an all-star cast. I mean, there were great, on the right, we see Tolstoy's plays. So there were Orthodox Jews who were highly educated and sophisticated and brought the Yiddish theater with them. This is one of my favorite buildings of the Lower East Side Jewish era. This was one of the major funeral parlors. It's interesting, it was built back in 1892 as the Kletzer Brotherly Aid Society. You can see the in the picture on the right on the top, established 1892. And it was for funerals, something we tend to forget. A Catholic funeral is very different from a Jewish funeral. An Orthodox Jewish funeral is very difficult from a Protestant funeral, to say nothing of a Chinese funeral. And so funerals and all the rituals surrounding with funerals were very much a part of the Lower East Side. The tenements continued to explode. The Civil War led to an explosion of apartments as more and more Jews moved in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. More people were living on the roof, piling onto balconies and onto fire escapes. Don't forget, back in the 1870s and 80s, there was no air conditioning. There was no central heating. You went down to the street to get water. The toilet was very often a pot that you, night soil they called it, that you would take down every morning and dump into the sewer. And so the Lower East Side continued to remain a very, very unhealthy place to live, disease-ridden. Now, one of the glorious monuments, which still thrives, of the Jewish period of the Lower East Side is, I'm sure you visited, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which is now a synagogue and a museum. The interior has been done, and a picture on the right, you see the main sanctuary, where they often have concerts and weddings and major events. In the basement, they have a very small Orthodox synagogue, and they really have great difficulty finding 10 men. I've walked there more than once, and there was somebody out on the street saying, "Are you Jewish? You know, can you be our 10th or our 8th or our 7th person, you know?" So I speak Hebrew and everything, so I lived in Israel, but I don't really want to, you know, lie and say, you know, I'm Jewish or anything. But this museum and synagogue has been carefully restored, and it is of the Hispano-Moorish architecture inspired by the golden age of the Jews in Spain. You can see the middle picture, the famous sawtooth archways and pillars, and it has been beautifully restored. They're very successful in fundraising. It was the synagogue of the elite. Other buildings which survive, we see the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School. Sign is still there with the date in Hebrew. Today it is an immigrant hostel for Chinese immigrants, but yet they have preserved the sign on the outside, which is nice. I'm glad they preserved it. Another building from the part finally is the Educational Alliance on East Broadway. A very interesting history in itself. It was established by German Reform Jews to go down and to civilize these Eastern European Orthodox Jews. They taught them English. They taught them skills. They taught the women, since it was established in 1889, women were taught how to type on a typewriter. Boys were taught electricity and carpentry skills. Well, their goal was to convert these Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe to good, modern, civilized Reform Jews. So they would hold dances on a Friday night. Well, where should a nice Orthodox boy and girl be Friday night? Definitely not at the Educational Alliance dancing the waltz and the polka with a girl who he had just met. But the Educational Alliance succeeded in converting the vast majority of the Orthodox Jews of the Lower East Side to the American melting pot. And the 500,000 Orthodox Jews of the Lower East Side went into the melting pot and they disappeared. Some of them ended up becoming Reform Jews and living on Long Island or marrying somebody else or going to California and changing their name and becoming somebody different. But they gradually, the Orthodox Jewish population of the Lower East Side assimilated and moved out, and they were replaced by another wave of immigrants. Today, when you go to the Lower East Side, you see the buildings which I've showed you, which remember the Scottish and the English period, remain memorials to the Irish and the German period, preserve the wonderful history of the Orthodox Eastern European period, but the people who are now the major residents of the Lower East Side are people who came over after 1965. And if you look at this graph, you can see the immigration graph. Very low immigration from World War I up until about 1970, 80, and suddenly the immigrant population skyrockets again. And that was the Hart-Cellar immigration law, which opened the door to new immigrants. It was because of this law that Flushing became Chinese and Korean. It is because of this law that Washington Heights became Dominican. It's because of this law that Jackson Heights became Hispanic, and because of this law that the Lower East Side became Chinese. Now, when Donald Trump says, I want to make America great again, he goes back to the year 1965, when there were very few Mexicans, almost no Chinese, no Muslims. The United States and his beloved Queens was white Christian population. So when Donald Trump says, make America great again, question is, when was America great? Before the law of 1965, which flooded the country with non-white and non-Christian people. Rutger's church is now a Hispanic church. You go in, the building is still there. Most people don't even know that it began as a Rutgers Protestant church, Presbyterian, then became an Irish Catholic church. They go in, they see the statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Half of the masses are in Spanish. So one church which has gone through 3 different immigrant groups. This is a famous place. This is the congregation BNAI, which was built in 1903, the high point of Eastern European presence there. You see the building, absolutely building on 15 Pike Street. Today, it is a Buddhist temple with offices and stores and everything in. At the entrance, you see one of the statues, a guardian statues, in front of the Buddhist temple. Very often you'll see the Chinese New Year being celebrated. So here again, it is a building which began as an Orthodox synagogue and now is a Buddhist temple. The Kletzer Brotherly Aid funeral parlor, well, it still says way up in the top that it was the Kletzer Brotherly Aid Society, but all the signs below it say it is now a Chinese funeral parlor. The Daily Forward building has preserved the Forward sign and the decorations, but it is now owned by a Chinese church, and it is office buildings with a church beside it. Well, one of the few Orthodox Jewish institutions which still thrives is the Mesivat Tfirat Yerushalayim, which was a yeshiva established in 1907. Now, it survives, and the Chinese would love to buy it, but it survives because it has become a residential Orthodox synagogue in the heart of what is now an overwhelmingly Chinese neighborhood. In fact, I have students at Toro who teach at the yeshiva. In the morning, you see the buses arriving with the teachers coming in from Brooklyn, the Orthodox areas of Brooklyn, and it still thrives, but once again, we don't know how long because all the buildings all around it are now owned by Chinese. I love this period at the top. We see the museum, Eldridge Street Museum, but on the left of that, you see the Chinese. In fact, there's a Chinese Buddhist temple right beside the Eldridge Street Synagogue, desperately trying to preserve as much as they can of the Chinese or of the Jewish neighborhood, but the Chinese are taking over everything. 2 other areas which still survive, Gus's Pickles, Katz's Deli, Yonah Schimmel. These are surviving, but they are barely surviving, and nobody knows how much longer they'll be able to resist the onslaught of the Chinese immigration. As you can see with Katz's Deli, on both sides, it is surrounded by brand new skyscrapers owned by rich Chinese from Taiwan, from Hong Kong and Shanghai, who are literally buying everything in sight. I went a couple of weeks ago to Yonah Schimmel's Knish Bakery. You can see since 1910. And they say that the Chinese are buying everything. You see the for rent sign above it. It was Chinese people that are renting the building, and they say it's only a question of time when the last vestiges of historic Jewish Lower East Side will disappear. So what's going to be with the future? Well, the Chinese have taken over Chinatown, or taken over the Lower East Side, just like they've taken over Little Italy. It has become one giant Chinatown. Very good investments. But what is going to be in the future? Well, my guess is that like everybody else who is called the Lower East Side home, they too will move out. The Chinese, really, do they want to live in a cramped apartment building when they could have a nice house out in Long Island with a front yard and a backyard and a dog and a cat and go to a suburban school? So the Lower East Side will eventually lose its Asian population. And who's going to take over next? Probably aliens. Now, once again, they'll build their houses of worship, they'll have their schools, they'll have their theaters, and a whole new chapter in the Lower East Side will begin. So we have something to look forward to. All right, so once again, this is me in the Lower East Side. You can see it must have been a cold day because I had longer hair and I had a scarf. If anybody has anything which they would like to contribute or comments, you can, if you want to, you can send them to this Gmail address. I respond usually quite rapidly. But if you have something you'd like to share now, I see Jeff is online.